These are apricot kernels, seeds that resemble and taste like almonds, used in recipes like Chinese almond tofu and the sweet Italian liquor amaretto. In online retailers, it is marketed as a natural source of vitamin B17, or lyocell. On the surface, it looks just like any other health food product, but look into the comments and it starts to get a little dubious. Some claim that eating apricot kernels has allowed their cancer to heal and recommend eating them daily for cancer prevention. One such comment claimed that eating these raw killed his father's cancer cells in a mere 3 weeks. Another claimed that a nephew with stage 4 prostate cancer decided not to go for surgery, chemo and radiation, and swapping to lyocell, and a plant-based diet saw his tumor go from the size of a baseball to a small grape. After intense study on cancer, the reviewer's eyes are opened to the atrocities inflicted on Americans by Big Pharma. Obviously, trusting Amazon reviews to find the next cancer cure isn't exactly the brightest idea. The compound found in apricot kernels responsible for anti-cancer claims is called amygdalin, sometimes also improperly named vitamin B17 and more frequently in history called lyocell. Thing is, scientific studies have found lyocell to be clinically ineffective in treating cancer and may in fact cause cyanide poisoning. This particular case in a Turkish university had 13 patients getting cyanide poisoning from eating apricot kernels. Here's another one in China, where a woman diagnosed with lung cancer died after eating apricot kernels on a daily basis. Although apricot kernels are allowed to be sold as health food, amygdalin or lyocell is not approved as a cancer treatment in the United States, and there are regulations in Europe controlling the amount of amygdalin in apricot kernels. The European Food Safety Agency commissioned a study that found amygdalin ineffective and toxic. Food Standards Australia New Zealand straight out banned apricot kernels from being sold, citing various reports of cyanide poisoning. Official health bodies from countries like Canada, UAE, and Malaysia have also sent out warnings about the dangers of eating raw apricot kernels. Yet, proponents of the apricot kernel just don't seem to listen. They see this as a giant conspiracy between the US, FDA, Big Pharma, and the medical community to discredit cheap cancer treatment methods in order to sell expensive treatments like chemotherapy. This almost cult-like crusade against the proven toxicity of apricot kernels can be seen almost anywhere online. You will find many YouTube videos warning of cyanide poisoning to be highly disliked. Commenters would call out content creators as propaganda and accusing them of taking money from Big Pharma.
So one of my patrons requested that I dedicate a video to reading comments on my vitamin B17 video. As you can see, this video got quite a lot of dislikes, so where's the hate coming from? Total horseshit. No one has ever gotten sick from apricot seeds. Try to find one. You can't. I eat them every day with absolutely no side effects. Professor Thick. Wow, I actually haven't heard that one before. Obviously, you are under the payroll of big pharmas. You should be ashamed of yourself. You only spew poison with your so-called scientific explanation. If conventional modalities can really cure cancer, how is it that at this very moment thousands upon thousands of people die of cancer every hour despite proper modern treatments? Please try to circumspect.
Digging deeper into the history of apricot kernels and lyocell, I would discover a rabbit hole of nearly half a century's worth of political and legal struggles. Arguably, no other alternative cancer treatment had provided as much of an effective challenge to the medical expertise in American history and managed the same amount of support which the apricot kernel achieved. The contentious history of lyocell would begin with Ernst T. Krebs, a pharmacist who received his medical degree from the San Francisco College of Physicians and Surgeons in 1903. During the Spanish flu, he became convinced that an old Native American remedy made from a rare species of parsley was effective against the disease, citing the Washoe tribe surviving the epidemic in greater numbers compared to other tribes. Claiming that this remedy was effective against asthma, whooping cough, tuberculosis, and pneumonia, he set up the Balsamia Company in San Francisco to market this remedy as Syrup Lepno. In the early 1920s, these supplies would be seized by the FDA, back then called the Bureau of Chemistry, on the grounds of false claims made by the product. In the 1940s, he worked together with his son, Ernst Krebs Jr., and submitted a patent for a drug partly manufactured from apricot kernels. After receiving a patent in 1949, he later started promoting this as pangamic acid, giving it the name vitamin B15, which he claims was effective against various ailments. However, other researchers say that there were insufficient data to determine if the molecule had in fact been isolated or characterized by them, and the data were not presented to support the curative properties. The Krebs method of producing the ester was also not reproducible, and available research don't show significant evidence to support their claims. Before Krebs, the compound amygdalin was already extracted from bitter almond seeds by two French chemists. In 1845, amygdalin was used as a cancer treatment in Russia, then 1892 in Germany. In both instances, it was considered too poisonous to be used for that purpose. Dr. Krebs had even two versions on the origins on how he and his son derived the refined form of amygdalin called lyocell. That is also to say, the exact date of origin isn't clear. Historian James Harvey Young suspects that Lyoctral's origins may have been backdated in order to evade the regulations of the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act implemented in 1938, as well as the Kefauver-Harris Amendment Act in 1962. The former would require new drugs to receive FDA approval that they were safe before legally allowed to be marketed in the US, and the latter requires that new drugs were both safe and effective. Lyoctral's canon story among promoters is furnished in a court affidavit signed by Dr. Krebs in 1965. This traces back to 1926, when Dr. Krebs was still a pharmacy student. While working on a bourbon flavouring, he made an extract from apricot kernels called saccharines. Basing his research on John Beard's trophoblastic theory, which was already a highly dismissed theory, Krebs theorized that the extract can break down cancer proteins. This first proved to be too toxic when injected into rats, but after improving its extraction process, he achieved a higher purity of amygdalin, and in 1949, his son, Krebs Jr., modified this again and named the result Lyotral. The other version of Lyotral's origins dates back to 1951. In an interview with FDA officials on December 1952, Dr. Krebs claims to have begun experimenting with an extract from apricot pits. He claims that when injected near a cancerous lesion, this is able to liquefy malignant growth by releasing cyanide. He further asserted that this was tested successfully on patients, though he had no records to prove so. According to Dr. Krebs' 1952 account, the time they worked on the 1950 article was when Lyotral was born, but the article in question only mentioned chymotrypsin, not Lyotral. Cancer specialists in California weren't convinced of Lyotral's efficacy and wanted to secure Lyotral from Krebs to undergo clinical trials. Krebs Jr. objected to these tests, saying that he is anxious to have clinical work commenced, but they would be too difficult for physicians ignorant of trophoblastic theory to test. When the Cancer Commission of the California Medical Association finally got hold of a supply of Lyotral, the commission investigated 44 patients treated with Lyotral and found no objective evidence that Lyotral alone was an effective control of cancer. While these had discredited the drug among the medical community, Lyotral's support would continue to grow behind the scenes, largely driven by one person. Although the son of a renowned Canadian general, he had been involved in the darker side of society, smuggling arms and advising on revolutions since 1946 through a consulting firm called Norcan in South America. In the press, MacNaughton had been surprisingly candid, and had seen his name entangled with the likes of stock swindles and the mafia. Through his experience in setting up factories, organizational networks and smuggling, MacNaughton established Lyotral factories in Monte Carlo, Geneva, Germany, and potentially 4 more in the United States after meeting Ernst Krebs around 1956 or 57. By operating on a small scale and being promoted as an unregulated investigatory drug, they had avoided regulatory troubles from the FDA. In 1960, Harry Hoxsey, another alternative cancer treatment salesman, was forced to close his clinics by the US government. His successor, who was no longer allowed to use Hoxsey's mixture, had ordered Lyotral, and this resulted in the FDA's first seizure of an interstate shipment of Lyotral. When the Kefauver-Harris law had finally been implemented, authorities fined Krebs Jr. $3,750. placing him on 3 years probation with provisions to not mess with Lyotral anymore. Andrew MacNaughton promptly moved Lyotral operations to Montreal, although this was soon illegal in Canada. In 1962, the Montreal General Hospital investigated 3 patients claimed to have been cured by Lyotral, but found that 2 had not had biopsies, and the cancer in the 3rd had spread. But production for Lyotral did not stop. MacNaughton managed to get Lyotral's visibility up, convincing surgeons to publish reports in alternative medicine journals and getting writers to publish articles and books. The favourable publicity got some US citizens to cross the borders to Montreal to get Lyotral injections, and operations continued in Canada until 1970, when he was forced to shut down. Operations once again changed locations, this time to Tijuana in Mexico. He then tried to get FDA approval for the experimental use of Lyotral on human subjects. The application had no new promising evidence of working, but the FDA approved it according to routine. 8 days later, the FDA sent a letter stating that the application can't be continued without more satisfactory data. When no new information arrived before the deadline, they cancelled the application. Although seemingly routine, that wasn't how Lyotral supporters interpreted the situation. The politics of the Vietnam War and Watergate had sown distrust and cynicism towards the government, steering people towards more populist ideologies. Pro-Lyotral literature had, at this point, moved outside the scientific community. Besides supporters of Lyotral, figures of various other unorthodox treatments enjoined by the FDA had also started consolidating together behind a single cause.
I plead with the FDA. Give us the freedom to choose our own therapy. Why should I, an American citizen, have to go on the black market or smuggle something that I should have the freedom to choose?
FDA's non-approval was seen as deception and conspiracy, that the FDA reversed the application because of pressure from political moguls of the cancer research establishment. Supporters of nutritional products pushed a campaign that successfully resulted in a series of legislation called the Proxmire Amendment. These amendments in 1976 made it so that food supplements could not be classified as drugs and were able to be sold without prescription from a doctor. Krebs argued that Lyocell is a vitamin. That is, cancer is a deficiency disease and could be prevented by regularly eating defatted apricot kernels. In addition, it needs to be administered as part of a complex program involving diet, exercise, rest, detoxification, minerals, and enzymes. Direct injections of Lyocell, on the other hand, are to be used for cancer treatment. Another important catalyst for Lyocell's popularity in the 70s was when one of the most prestigious cancer centers in the world, the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, got involved with Lyocell. Kanematsu Sugiura, a well-known cancer researcher, conducted the experiment twice and found that Lyocell tended to inhibit the spread of certain tumors. Though these experiments were completed in 1973, they were never published. According to Chester Stock, vice president of the institute and the one in charge of later experiments, publishing those early positive data would have caused all kinds of havoc. But by 1975, these data were too controversial to hide. Lyocell supporters had gotten hold of Sugiura's paper and published it in a pamphlet entitled Anatomy of a Cover-Up. In 1977, Sloan Kettering then completed another more thorough and comprehensive study on Lyocell, but this time, the findings found that Lyocell was ineffective.
Our summary statement is we do not have evidence supporting taking amygdalin to clinical trial.
We tried to find out from scientific information available whether there was any real scientific evidence that the drug amygdalin, or the so-called Latril, had any effect on cancer in any form, and there was no such scientific evidence.
Within months of the 1977 findings, serious objections were raised by Lyocell supporters, alleging that Sloan Kettering suppressed findings and rigged their experiments.
They went ahead and tested Latril in this same system. It seems pretty obvious that they expected Latril to fail in this system, but Latril didn't fail. All told, there were 20 positive experiments with Latril done at Sloan Kettering between 1972 and 1977. Latril alone never cured any cancers in mice at Sloan Kettering. Latril had certain positive effects in stopping the spread of the cancer. Sugiura said it was the best effects he had seen in 60 years.
Lyocell advocates also started contesting court cases to prevent the FDA from banning interstate sales, winning permission to import supplies of Lyocell. In the most famous of these cases, Rutherford v. United States, the judge held that, in being denied freedom of choice for treatment by Lyocell to alleviate or cure their cancer, the cancer patient were deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Although the FDA appealed, the Court of Appeals ruled in favor of Rutherford. By taking the dispute out of the scientific community and into state legislatures, proponents of Lyocell had successfully pushed for legalization. In 1976, Alaska became the first of many states to legalize Lyocell. That isn't to say that Lyocell was on the path to complete legalization. Most would only permit physicians to prescribe Lyocell for terminally ill patients. In many states, the drug is not allowed to be prescribed, and it was definitely not FDA approved. Not every court case started were in favor of Lyocell. A widow in Georgia sued the physicians who prescribed only Lyocell for her husband's cancer. The jury had decided that the physician was not responsible for her husband's death, though they decided on an award of $15,000 for medical and other expenses attendant upon his last illness. It is estimated that over the next decade, more than 70,000 Americans took Lyocell. Those who were denied by their stateside doctors had crossed into Mexico for injections. Most famously, actor Steve McQueen secretly traveled to Baja in 1980 to receive Lyocell for an advanced lung cancer. He died months later during surgery, despite US doctors advising that a tumor was inoperable.
Mexico is showing the world this new way of fighting cancer through non-specific metabolic therapies. God bless you all. Steve McQueen.
He died this morning in another Mexican clinic. His heart stopped beating after doctors removed one of the tumors. McQueen was just 50.
In the face of the multitude of political and legal battles, there was a sense of urgency for a definitive study to prove or disprove Lyocell's efficacy. In the ideal scenario, This would have been a clinical trial done on human patients. But this proved to be difficult as the prevailing system required drugs to first pass animal tests before moving to volunteers. Additionally, LiarTrial supporters were not in agreement towards the validity of experiments conducted by the medical establishment. For instance, the exact composition of LiarTrial is heavily debated, and it is thought that there were multiple versions of the drug. LiarTrial supporters also considered the size of the cancer lump to be irrelevant, which went against the view of traditional oncologists. While publicly appealing for testing, LiarTrial proponents had also been reluctant or unable to provide complete data on patients for evaluation. Around 1978, the National Cancer Institute had hoped to get full enough records of the 70,000 patients for a retrospective study and appealed to more than 400,000 physicians and other health professionals for said records. However, in the end, only 93 cases were submitted for evaluation, among which only 6 were evaluable for response. Based on these 6 cases, the NCI decided to sponsor Phase 1 and Phase 2 clinical trials. The definitive Phase 2 clinical trial was conducted in 1982, with 178 patients, conducted just the way LiarTrial is recommended, with high doses of LiarTrial and a special metabolic therapy program. It concluded that LiarTrial is a toxic drug that is not effective as a cancer treatment. Before these trials were concluded, Californian officials had also been investigating key figures of the LiarTrial movement. They found that Robert Bradford of Los Altos, president of a 35,000-member organization seeking to legalize LiarTrial, had been taking in $150,000 to $200,000 a month on LiarTrial sales. The inquiry also revealed that Krebs Jr., although commonly referred to as a doctor, had not actually completed medical school and was expelled after repeating his freshman year and failing his sophomore year. The doctorate degree he holds is awarded by a small Bible school in Tulsa, which was not empowered to award any degrees other than a bachelor's. Records would also indicate that Krebs and his brother, Brian Krebs, had an income of $250,000 in 1970 and 1971 from the sale of LiarTrial and other substances not recognized as valid drugs. Dr. Richardson, one of the first physicians to promote LiarTrial as a cancer cure, was barely making ends meet through his medical practice before prescribing LiarTrial. After being involved, his net income rose more than tenfold, from $10,400 to $172,000. McNaughton's alleged stock scandals and involvement in LiarTrial was also summarized. In total, the size of LiarTrial smuggling in recent years had been estimated at $20 million. Today, LiarTrial still has a thriving community of believers. Gregory Sana, one of the co-authors of the 1982 clinical trial, remembers that some of the patients wanting the treatment to be continued, even though their tumor had clearly grown, they had gotten weaker and clearly more sick. Testimonies of cancer patients who claimed that LiarTrial cured their cancer are all over the internet, like this one which got hundreds of thousands of views. 3 decades after Dr. Richardson's death, his son, John Richardson Jr., now operates the health food chain Apricot Power, selling products like Vita Seeds, tablets, and anti-aging foam. Though the revenue numbers are unknown, his family operation of around 10 employees have served thousands of customers all over the world since 1999. This time, the word cancer isn't used in marketing to avoid trouble with the FDA. Ralph Moss, the science writer and whistleblower who leaked information about Dr. Sugiura's results, now charges cancer patients $800 for hour-long phone consultations. There are also those like Jason Vale, a professional arm wrestler who claims that his kidney cancer was healed because of apricot seeds, and then sold those seeds as a cure. He was convicted in 2003 and sentenced to 5 years in prison for not heeding warnings from the FDA. Apparently, this small venture had raked in $850,000 from 2013 to 2019 selling apricot seeds and related products. Though, in an interview with Access, he said that he don't know the numbers and these go into paying employees and the products.
You made nearly $1 million over the past 6 years selling these seeds.
$1 million? No.
And some other items to go along with them.
I don't know the numbers, but that goes paying for the product, that goes paying for people packing things. When you say preying on people, I would never do that. I was a cancer victim. I just want to help people. That's all I want to do is help people and open their eyes to doing other things besides just chemo and radiation, which I don't even tell people not to do chemo and radiation. I did chemo and radiation when I was 19 years old. And I think it might have helped save my life for a few years until I found out about the seeds.
The other side of the story are people who died from cancer after seeking alternative treatment, like in the case of Charlene Campbell. Campbell's daughter developed a rare form of cancer that only 40 to 50 children in the world has, and died at the age of 12 months. 5 years later, Campbell developed breast cancer. Having watched her daughter undergo chemotherapy, she developed a fear of the disease and didn't want to use the same treatment. Her replacement was alternative treatment, which included an all-vegetarian diet, cannabis oil, and apricot seeds. Soon after her 33rd birthday, she died of cancer. Laetrile and apricot kernel studies are still being conducted today. A 2015 review looked over 200 references to find 69 potentially relevant references, but couldn't find any reliable evidence that they could cure cancer. The European Food Safety Authority's study summarized many cases of cyanide poisoning, including 260 cases of children hospitalized in Turkey from the year 2000 to 2004, and a 28-month-old girl who died after eating 10 apricot kernels. What is even stranger is that even though Laetrile supporters tend to advise for eating more apricot kernels, the conspiracy theory book and accompanying documentary World Without Cancer, which is commonly said to be a must-read to learn about Laetrile, says this.
Nature can do only so much. It cannot anticipate excess of this kind. Therefore, it's wise to follow the simple rule that one should not eat at one time more seeds than he likely would consume if he also were eating a reasonable quantity of the whole fruit. This is a common sense rule with a large safety margin that can be followed with complete confidence.
But why exactly are people still so adamant about apricot kernel's effectiveness? Are there any merits to their arguments? Up to date, the scientific merits of Laetrile and apricot kernels are still being studied. In fact, there are many studies that would conclude by saying things like might be useful as an anti-cancer agent. Amygdalin combinations in treatment of bone cancer are significant and may be considered a valuable candidate for specific treatment of breast cancer patients. The reason that these studies still don't allow Laetrile to qualify as an effective cancer treatment isn't because of some giant conspiracy, but that these theories simply aren't the best kinds of evidence we have. Many such studies are in vitro studies, which basically means these are conducted in a petri dish. Killing cancer cells in a petri dish is a lot different than in a human body. In a petri dish, a handgun can also kill cancer cells. Scientific evidence is typically ranked in a hierarchy, and the best kinds of evidence are usually randomized human clinical trials. Of that, the best evidence we have is only the one conducted in 1982, and that particular trial doesn't even have a control group. To understand the arguments of a Laetrile supporter, I have also given the book written by conspiracy theorist G. Edward Griffin, World Without Cancer, a read. While the book raised various interesting points, reading the book proved to be incredibly difficult as nearly every sentence in the book required me to fact-check. In one chapter, the merits of the apricot kernel are said to be found in the diets of the Hunzakuts, said to have no known incidence of cancer and a life expectancy of beyond 100 years. Problem is, this is a myth far from the truth. The Hunza secret to OH is an absence of birth records, and illiterate elders tend to overestimate their ages. They also tended to suffer from various ailments. John Clark, a geologist who spent 20 months with the Hunza people in the 1950s and wrote this book, found that they were overall unhealthy. Additionally, World Without Cancer fails to distinguish between bitter and sweet varieties of apricot kernels. John Clark's book has a paragraph describing that Hunzas tend to eat sweet apricot nuts plain, while the bitter ones are extracted for their oil, which is highly poisonous. In one case, John Clark mentioned that the Hunzas, after a winter feast called the Tumushuling, tend to develop very sore stomachs, and this is because the Hunzas used bitter apricot oil to flavor their wine, and this gave them cyanide poisoning from the prussic acid. In another page, it also mentions cases where women ate 50 bitter apricot seeds to commit suicide. I also found a Hunza cooking channel, and left a comment asking if they eat apricot kernels raw and got cyanide poisoning. Cooking Clinic replied that she didn't witness such cases, but eating too much bitter apricot kernels is not recommended. All that was just from fact-checking 3 pages of the World Without Cancer book, so I hope you can understand how painful it was to read. In World Without Cancer, a whole conspiracy between the Rockefeller and Big Pharma is also constructed, but unfortunately, fact-checking that would be too much of an undertaking. Instead, let's tackle this particular claim made in the book with common sense, that the cancer industry earns too much money, so they are denying the cheap cures like Laetrile. Let's assume that we don't already know that Laetrile sellers are earning quite a lot of money. All it takes for the big pharma theory to fall is for one pharma company to start using apricot kernels and undercut everybody else. Now, let us assume that all of the American pharma has conspired together. Now all we need is simply the understanding that other countries exist outside of the United States. For example, one country that doesn't like the US is China, which according to Nature Index has 38 institutions out of the top 200 in the world for cancer research. One would imagine that drawing cancer patients around the world away from the US to China is a really good show of power and technological advancement. Just like this one in Guangzhou, which received over 30,000 overseas patients for a somewhat relatively obscure surgery called cryotherapy. What you also realize if you have knowledge of traditional Chinese medicine is that apricot kernels are highly priced, and apricot forests are a synonym for the traditional Chinese medicine field. So a headline like "Ancient Chinese Medicine Unlocks New Possibilities for Cancer Treatment" would have been a really good headline that shows Chinese superiority over the Westerners who lost their chance finding a cancer cure while having meaningless political infighting. Of course, I'm not saying that the conspiracy argument is entirely without merit. The book Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre manages to do this without resorting to conspiracy theories, some of which include questioning why clinical trials routinely reach conclusions favorable to the company. Clinical trials withholding treatment known to work for the purpose of skewing test results causing 11 children to die, or selling more expensive drugs even though they weren't more effective. You don't have to resort to conspiracy theories and bad science to criticize Big Pharma. I certainly won't say that it's impossible for apricot kernels to be beneficial against cancer, but it would be stupid to deny the evidence we have and blindly trust apricot kernel sellers who more than likely have a great financial incentive to sell you conspiracy theories. As for the rest of Laya trial history, there are a lot not covered in this video, as the entire story is simply too complicated. Hopefully, this is still educational, and now you know the whole story why apricot kernels are being sold as health food. There are still legitimate uses for them, like in Chinese almond tofu, and in certain hunza recipes. If you're worried about cyanide, grinding, soaking and cooking generally reduces the amount of cyanide content. That's the end of the video. If you would like to support the channel, consider giving a like, sub or donation. I spent more than a month working on this video, and I greatly appreciate the support.